Hello, awesome people. I hope you're having a great day today. Today we're taking a look at an epic poem that was published in the 14th century. It's called Pearl. It's in the same collection here by J.R.R. Tolkien's translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that he translated as a part of this next afterwards. So I'm going to do my review of it and talking about more in detail with you here further. I've never heard of Pearl before. I've never read it before. So it was nice to go out there and read it. So let's go ahead and get started. It's about 40 pages long. It took me about an hour for me to knock it out 2 nights ago. And then last night I read about a half an hour long of the commentary that's on this. So I have had both of those sort of experiences and so forth. This is a very interesting poem to rank or talk about because it's not a whole lot of stuff happens. It's really more about this person who finds and adopts this young girl, and then we'll find out early on in the 40 pages, and spoiler-free review, but it's hard to do it here because we find out like in the first couple of stanzas what's going to ultimately happen to her. So really spoiler-free doesn't really apply here, although that's my standard. But what winds up happening is that she's fated to die. And so he's calling her the Pearl that he lost, and so that's where the name of this comes from the parent who is lamenting the loss of his daughter, and so that's what's going to happen. And then we find out, and then for like 35 pages of this, we have a sort of theological conversation about what that's like, what the after effects are, told from a Christian perspective. And that's not your typical sort of thing that you would expect from a poem that's being written, right? So it's an interesting thing to talk about or to review. How do you review a poem that doesn't really have a plot? It's just a philosophical conversation, right? An epic. It's told in an epic verse. It was originally written and translated by J.R.R. Tolkien. And but how do you review it? That's obviously a key question, right? So what I'm doing is I'm reviewing it based on the poem itself. It was hard to get into. It took me a while, but once I got about 10 pages into it, I got to what I was trying to do and the meter of it, the rhymes, and so forth, and so forth. So it took me a while to get into it, but then I ultimately did and was committed to it. And my goal was to knock it out in 20 pages each day. But I was so into it, it was just a half an hour in. I just went ahead and knocked it out. So it definitely had that once I got into it. It just was harder to get into. So I'm not giving it as high a review. It also doesn't have a plot, right? And so it's hard to review, an epic poem that's that long without a plot. So so I'm only going to be giving this probably about a 7 out of 10 because of that. It was well done. It was gripping, but it was more theological. And so forth on conversation rather than that the author is having, and rather than a bunch of plot that happens to have a theological conclusion. Rather, so it's an interesting side, but it doesn't take that much of your time. But if you're buying the collection I linked to you on the previous review, the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that's definitely fun. You can probably also find it online. I'll try to find it for you online. I'm sure somebody's translation of it is past the copyright date since it's centuries old. His won't be because it just got published in 2021. He started working on these poems near the end of his life when he realized that it was probably going to be published posthumously. So he went back. So he did initial translations of these early on, decades before his death, but he went back to these poems that are written by this guy. There's one more left in here. I'm going to start working on that tonight. It's actually really pretty short, so I might be able to just knock it out in the commentary in one night. So I might be back tomorrow. But it was pretty fun. I definitely enjoyed knocking it out in the commentary on it. Now, there is some critique on this poem. One on how to interpret it. For example, many people initially interpreted it as just a sort of pure concept. This is what the person said it was about. It was about the loss of a young child who died very young, and what happens. And then this is also, if you will, a poem that's been reviewed by some people. It's just be more of an allegory rather than just what it says. It's more of an allegory. It was written more just to talk about the general loss of children and precious people in our lives, right? Another point that one critic made It's mentioned by the editor in here that the name that he gives the child Pearl and that he calls her throughout the things also could have been in the Catholic of that era, could have been a Latin name that was very common during that era. So he could have literally named her after a Catholic saint. That could have been her saint name, because there's a couple of saints that have the Latin name Pearl in it. So he thinks, so that also said that might not just be like, the pearl of great price or something like that, or somebody who wore out a pearl, right, that somebody pays a lot for, that was highly desired back in that era, and it also represents purity of a young child, but also has that sort of a concept to it too. It could have been actually that person's name in Latin could have been Pearl, and if that was their saint name after they were baptized. So anyway, and we find out that they were baptized, so that would make sense. So anyway, I'll go ahead and leave you to it. Why am I reviewing something that was written? In this place translated by J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, it's not in the three major criterias of my collection. Great question. Well, first of all, I regularly do things in my three genres: horror, science fiction, and fantasy. But sometimes when a writer is very influential, I do something that's outside of their genres. For example, Stephen King has written some novels that are not in the horror genre, even though he's known as a horror writer. What if I were to pick up one of those and read it, but it's not a horror short story, and it's not fantasy or science fiction either? Would you take that? Probably. I don't think anybody would push back. For example, Robert E. Howard, one of the biggest influences in fantasy of all time, wrote with his stuff like Conan the Barbarian. It's definitely still read today. He wrote a series of stories in the boxing genre about a boxing champion, and there's more boxing short stories than he's written with that character than there are Conan short stories. So, I mean, I've read and reviewed some of those for this channel, and I've also done some Shirley Jackson, a famous horror writer, in one of her collections from Penguin Classics called Dark Tales, some of which were not horror, but were still pretty good, and I definitely brought you guys attention. So that does happen occasionally, and J.R.R. Tolkien is one of the most influential names. Also, and even though he says translator here, I brought you his last two translations, right? And again, that he didn't write. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that, and I'm also going to give you the next one too. That's the last one. It seems pretty short. So that's one reason why we're doing it. A second reason, as a reminder, the channel's name is The Worst Thing About New Books, which is a quote by a French philosopher named Jacques Joubert, who said that the worst thing about new books was that they kept us from reading the old ones. And so something that was written, in this case a poem, hundreds of years ago, is definitely sort of a par for the course. So there you are. Have you read this or something or heard of it? If so, what did you think about it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Did you agree or disagree with my rating? Let's talk about that too. If you enjoyed this video, why not hit that subscribe button? There should be a lot more of these to follow. And then finally, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of our day and investing it and watching my video. We all have so many things that are happening in our lives, and we're bold in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me is incredibly humbling, and I appreciate it. So thanks again, and have an amazing day.